Every single empire that has ever existed, from Rome to Britain to the Soviet Union, fell not because they were conquered by external enemies or because their populations rebelled against tyranny, but because they made the same mathematical error that appears different in each era, but follows an identical pattern. And this pattern is so predictable that you can see it unfolding in real time right now in the United States and know with near certainty how it will end, because it has ended the same way every single time throughout history without exception. The pattern begins when a dominant power uses its military and economic strength to establish a system where other nations must use its currency for trade, which creates artificial demand that allows the empire to import real goods and services in exchange for paper or digital currency that costs almost nothing to produce. And this arrangement is so profitable and so seductive that the empire begins spending more than it produces, running deficits that would bankrupt any normal country, but that the empire can sustain because foreign nations need its currency and will continue accepting it, even as the imbalance grows. But here is what every empire discovers too late. The very mechanism that allows unlimited spending is also the mechanism that guarantees eventual collapse, because the debt accumulates faster than the economy grows, and the interest on that debt eventually exceeds the empire's ability to pay from tax revenues. And when that mathematical tipping point is reached, the empire faces an impossible choice between defaulting on its obligations or debasing its currency to inflate away the debt, and either choice destroys the foundation of power that made the empire dominant in the first place. But before I show you the exact mathematical formula that has destroyed every empire and the specific point at which the United States crossed the threshold of no return, and what that means for anyone living in America right now who believes their savings and their future are secure, let me tell you about a Roman emperor named Nero, who discovered this pattern the hard way in the 1st century AD. Because what happened to Rome is happening to America, with such precise similarity that it would be funny if it were not so terrifying. Rome in the year 54 AD was the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, controlling the Mediterranean and most of Europe, and commanding legions that no enemy could defeat in open battle. And the Roman denarius was the reserve currency of the known world, accepted everywhere because it was made of pure silver and because Rome's power guaranteed its value. But maintaining an empire is expensive. Legions must be paid, roads and aqueducts must be built, grain must be imported to feed the population of Rome, which had grown too large to support itself from local agriculture. And most costly of all, the emperor needed to provide circuses and handouts to keep the populace content and prevent riots that could threaten his rule. Nero faced the same dilemma that every leader faces when spending exceeds revenues. He could raise taxes which would be unpopular and might trigger rebellion, or he could cut spending on the military which would weaken Rome's defenses, or he could find some clever way to create more money without actually having to produce more wealth. And being the clever person he thought he was, Nero chose the third option. He ordered that new denarii be minted with less silver content, mixing in base metals like copper and zinc, so that each coin contained only 90% of the silver that previous coins had contained, and this allowed him to mint 10% more coins from the same amount of silver, which meant he could spend 10% more without raising taxes or cutting the budget. And at first, this seemed like a brilliant solution, because most people did not notice the difference, and life continued as before. But merchants and money changers noticed immediately. They began weighing coins and testing their purity. And once they realized that new coins contained less silver, they started demanding more coins in exchange for goods, which is what we call inflation. And soon the Roman government found itself in exactly the same position as before, unable to meet its obligations with the revenue it collected. And so they repeated the debasement, reducing silver content to 80%, then 70%, then 50%. And by the time Rome fell in the 5th century, the denarius contained less than 5% silver and was essentially worthless. And here is what should make your blood run cold. Every empire that followed Rome repeated this exact same pattern. The Spanish Empire debased their currency to pay for wars in Europe. The French monarchy debased their currency until the Revolution swept them away. The British Empire abandoned the gold standard to finance World War I and never recovered their previous dominance. And the Soviet Union collapsed when they could no longer pay their debts in a currency that anyone valued. And right now, in 2025, The United States is following the same path with such precision that historians a century from now will look back and wonder why nobody stopped it when the pattern was so obvious, because since '71, when Nixon closed the gold window and ended any pretense that dollars were backed by real assets, the United States has been creating currency at an accelerating rate to finance spending that far exceeds what the economy produces. And the only reason this has not caused immediate collapse is that the dollar is still the world's reserve currency, which creates artificial demand. But that status is eroding as other nations realize they are accepting depreciating paper in exchange for real goods and are actively building alternative systems to escape the dollar trap. The mathematical formula that determines when an empire crosses the point of no return is actually quite simple, though economists obscure it with complex language to hide the reality from ordinary people who might panic if they understood how precarious the situation has become. The formula is that when the interest payments on government debt exceed 10% of tax revenues, the debt spiral becomes irreversible because the government must borrow money just to pay interest on existing debt, which increases the total debt, which increases the interest payments, which requires more borrowing, creating a cycle that accelerates exponentially until either the currency collapses or the government defaults, or some combination of both destroys the financial system. And right now, in late 2025, the United States government pays approximately $1 trillion per year in interest on $36 trillion in debt, and that $1 trillion represents approximately 15% of total federal tax revenues, which means America has already crossed the threshold that every previous empire crossed before collapse. And the trajectory is not improving, but worsening because the debt grows faster than the economy and because interest rates are higher than they were during the years of zero-rate policy. But here is where it gets truly alarming, and I need you to stay with me because what I am about to reveal is something that most Americans do not understand and that politicians actively hide because acknowledging it would trigger the very crisis they are trying to prevent. The $36 trillion in official debt is only part of the real obligation because it does not include unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare and federal pensions, which represent promises to pay future benefits that are not backed by any corresponding assets or dedicated revenue streams. If you include these unfunded liabilities, which any honest accounting would require because they are legal obligations that must be paid or defaulted on, the real debt of the United States government exceeds $150 trillion, which is more than 4 times the entire GDP of the country. And servicing this debt at even modest interest rates would require tax revenues far beyond what the economy can generate without destroying the productive capacity that creates the wealth in the first place. If you are feeling that sick realization that the system you trusted is built on mathematics that cannot work, if you are starting to understand that the retirement benefits you were promised and the savings you accumulated and the future you planned are all based on assumptions that history proves are false, then you are beginning to see what very few people are willing to acknowledge. And if you want to understand what happens in the final stages of this cycle, how empires behave when they know collapse is coming but cannot admit it publicly, and what individuals can do to protect themselves when the collective system is failing, then subscribe immediately, because what comes next will show you the specific sequence of events that unfolds in every debt collapse and the warning signs that indicate which stage we are currently in. The Spanish Empire in the 16th century provides the clearest example of how debt traps destroy even the most powerful nations, because Spain, at the height of its power, controlled the largest empire in history, stretching from Europe to the Americas to the Philippines, and they had access to essentially unlimited gold and silver flowing from mines in Mexico and Peru, which should have made them the wealthiest nation on earth. But Spain's expenditures exceeded even these vast resources because they were fighting wars across Europe to defend Catholicism and maintain their territorial possessions, and they borrowed heavily from Italian and German bankers who charged interest rates of 15 to 20%, and the gold and silver that flowed from the New World did not stay in Spain but went directly to the bankers to service the debt. And this is the crucial insight that explains why empires collapse despite controlling vast resources, because debt accumulates faster than resources can be extracted, and once you are in the debt trap, the productive capacity of your empire becomes irrelevant because you are working not for yourself, but for your creditors, and eventually the burden becomes so great that default is inevitable. Spain defaulted on its debts 4 times in the 16th century, in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, and each time they restructured their obligations and promised to reform their finances, and within a few years they were borrowing again at even higher interest rates because the wars continued and the spending continued, and the fundamental problem was never addressed. And each default weakened Spain's position, making future borrowing more expensive and eroding confidence in Spanish power. And by the early 17th century, Spain was no longer the dominant force in Europe, despite still controlling a vast empire, because other nations understood that Spanish promises were worthless and Spanish power was hollow. And within another century, Spain had lost most of its territory and had fallen from the first rank of nations to a second-rate power that would never recover its former position. The British Empire followed a similar path 3 centuries later, but with a crucial difference that delayed their collapse. They built a financial system sophisticated enough to manage larger debts for longer periods, inventing central banking and government bonds, and the gold standard that allowed them to borrow at lower rates than previous empires. Britain in the 19th century was the workshop of the world, producing half of all manufactured goods and controlling the seas with a navy larger than the next several nations combined. And the British pound was the reserve currency backed by gold held in the vaults of the Bank of England. And this system worked brilliantly as long as Britain ran trade surpluses and accumulated gold faster than they created currency. But World War I destroyed this careful balance because the war was so expensive that Britain had to borrow enormous sums from the United States and had to print money beyond what their gold reserves could support. And when the war ended, Britain owed more money than the entire value of their economy, and the pound, which had been pegged to gold at a fixed rate for over a century, was no longer credible because everyone knew Britain did not have enough gold to redeem all the pounds in circulation. Britain tried to maintain the gold standard through the 1920s, but the attempt required such high interest rates to attract gold that it crushed the domestic economy, causing unemployment and deflation and social unrest. And in 1931, Britain finally abandoned gold and devalued the pound, which was admission that the empire could no longer maintain the financial standard that had made it dominant. And from that moment, Britain's decline was inevitable. They lost their reserve currency status to the United States. They lost their colonies as independence movements swept through Africa and Asia, and they transformed from an empire on which the sun never set to a second-tier power dependent on American support. And all of this happened not because they lost wars or faced revolution, but because the mathematics of debt destroyed their ability to maintain the system that had made them powerful. The pattern repeats with such consistency that you can predict the sequence of events once you recognize the stage of the cycle. First comes the period of dominance, when the empire controls trade and military power, and their currency is accepted everywhere. Then comes the period of overextension, when military and social spending exceeds productive capacity and debt begins accumulating. Then comes the period of financial engineering, when the empire tries to maintain appearances through monetary manipulation and currency debasement. Then comes the period of crisis, when debt service exceeds manageable levels, and the empire must choose between default and hyperinflation. And finally comes the period of collapse, when the currency fails and the empire fractures and a new power emerges to establish a new order. And the United States is currently in the third stage, the period of financial engineering, where massive quantities of currency are being created to service debt and maintain the illusion of prosperity. And the transition to the fourth stage of crisis will happen suddenly when some trigger event causes foreign nations or domestic investors to lose confidence in the dollar and refuse to continue accepting depreciating paper in exchange for real goods. Do you see how history does not repeat, but rhymes, how the specific details change with technology and culture, but the underlying mathematics remain constant, how every empire believes they are different and have somehow transcended the limitations that destroyed previous powers, but in fact, they are following the same script that has been performed dozens of times before. And do you understand that your belief that America is too big, or too powerful, or too essential to fail is the same belief that Romans held, and Spaniards held, and Britons held, and that belief did not save them and will not save America, because mathematics does not care about your feelings or your patriotism or your investment portfolio. The signs that collapse is approaching are all around us if you know what to look for. And I'm going to walk you through them one by one so you can see how far advanced the cycle is and how little time remains to prepare. First, foreign nations are reducing their holdings of US Treasury bonds and diversifying into gold and other currencies, which means the artificial demand that supports the dollar is weakening, and the day is approaching when Treasury auctions will fail because nobody wants to buy bonds that will be repaid in depreciated currency. Second, the Federal Reserve is trapped between inflation and recession, unable to raise rates high enough to attract capital without crashing the economy, unable to lower rates without triggering currency collapse, forced to maintain an impossible balance that can only last until some external shock forces their hand. Third, political dysfunction has made fiscal reform impossible. Neither party will cut spending or raise taxes sufficiently to address the debt, because doing so would be political suicide, so the debt continues growing until mathematics forces an adjustment that will be far more painful than any voluntary reform would have been. Fourth, wealth inequality has reached levels comparable to the final years of previous empires, when a tiny elite controlled most assets while the majority struggled to afford basic necessities. And this inequality is not coincidental but structural, created by monetary policies that benefit those closest to the money printer while impoverishing those furthest away. And history shows that this level of inequality is unsustainable and eventually triggers either revolution or collapse, or both. Fifth, military overextension has America maintaining bases in over 70 countries and fighting multiple conflicts. Simultaneously, just as Rome maintained legions across 3 continents and Britain maintained garrisons around the globe, and the cost of this overextension exceeds what the economy can support, meaning that every year of maintaining empire brings the moment of reckoning closer. And here is what virtually nobody in power will tell you, but that everyone who studies the history of empires understands: the collapse, when it comes, will not be gradual or manageable. It will be sudden and catastrophic, because that is how complex systems fail. They appear stable until the moment they are not, and the transition from apparent stability to obvious crisis happens so quickly that most people will not have time to react. The trigger could be a sovereign debt crisis in Europe or Japan that spreads through interconnected financial markets, a conflict with China that disrupts trade and reveals how dependent America has become on imports, a cyber attack that disables financial infrastructure and triggers bank runs, or simply the recognition by a critical mass of dollar holders that holding a depreciating currency makes no economic sense, and that alternatives exist that are not subject to the same debasement. If this has shaken your faith in the permanence of American power, if you recognize now that the patterns from history are not abstract academic exercises, but warnings about what is coming to the country you live in and depend on, then you need to see what we reveal in the next episode, because understanding that collapse is coming is only the first step. The second step is understanding how wealth is preserved or destroyed during these transitions, and how to position yourself and your family for the greatest wealth transfer in modern history. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, review your assets, and ask yourself honestly whether they will retain value when the dollar's reserve status ends, and whether you are prepared for a world where the assumptions of the past 70 years no longer apply. The tragedy of debt traps is that they are entirely predictable and entirely preventable. Every empire that fell into the trap could see the pattern developing and knew what the outcome would be, but they continued down the path anyway, because the political incentives favor short-term spending over long-term sustainability, because the benefits of deficit spending accrue immediately while the costs are pushed into the future, because voters demand services and politicians who tell them those services cannot be afforded lose elections to politicians who promise to deliver them regardless of the math. This is the fundamental flaw in democratic governance during the terminal phase of empire. The ability to vote yourself benefits from the treasury, creates a race to the bottom where each successive government increases spending to win votes until the debt burden becomes unsupportable and the system collapses. And this is not unique to America, but has happened in every democracy that controlled a reserve currency and had the ability to borrow in its own money. The Roman Republic fell to the empire precisely because the Senate kept voting for grain subsidies and public works and military adventures that the Republic could not afford, and those who warned about debt were shouted down as unpatriotic or uncaring about the poor, and by the time the fiscal crisis was undeniable, the damage was irreversible, and the only solution was to concentrate power in an emperor who could impose austerity by force since it could not be achieved through consensus. Weimar Germany collapsed into hyperinflation and then into totalitarianism because the democratic government printed money to pay reparations and domestic obligations until the currency became worthless. And the chaos that followed brought Hitler to power with promises to restore order and make Germany great again, which he did through methods that destroyed half of Europe and killed tens of millions. The pattern is consistent. Debt crises that are not resolved through voluntary reform are resolved through either dictatorship or collapse or external conquest, and none of these outcomes is desirable, but all are more likely than a peaceful, democratic solution once the debt trap has been allowed to develop to late stages. And America is in the late stages now. The debt cannot be paid from existing tax revenues, even with dramatic spending cuts. The currency cannot be maintained at current value without interest rates that would crash the economy. The reserve status cannot be preserved when foreign nations are actively building alternatives. The political system cannot agree on reforms because the reforms required would cause immediate pain that voters will not accept. And the only remaining option is to continue the charade until some external event forces the crisis that everyone knows is coming, but nobody wants to trigger. And when the crisis comes, the wealth destruction will be measured in trillions. Retirement accounts that took decades to build will evaporate in weeks. Savings that represented security will lose most of their value. Government promises will be broken or paid in currency worth a fraction of what was expected. And the middle class that has been the foundation of American prosperity will be wiped out just as surely as the Roman middle class was wiped out when the denarius collapsed, and the Spanish middle class was wiped out when the peso collapsed, and the German middle class was wiped out when the mark collapsed. The question facing every American right now is not whether this will happen, but when it will happen, and whether you will be positioned to survive it, because some people will emerge from the crisis wealthier than before, not because they were lucky, but because they understood the pattern and positioned themselves accordingly, holding assets that retain value during currency crises, maintaining skills that are valuable in any economy, building networks and relationships that transcend the financial system, and most importantly, understanding that the promises from government and the assumptions about perpetual prosperity and the belief that tomorrow will be like yesterday are all false, and that the only security comes from self-reliance and preparation. History does not offer hope that America will somehow avoid the fate of previous empires because the mathematics are identical and the political incentives are identical, and the human nature that drives these cycles is identical. And the kindest thing I can do is warn you that the cycle is far advanced and time is running out to prepare for what comes next. And whether you believe me or dismiss this as doomerism or acknowledge the pattern, but convince yourself that somehow you will be spared. The mathematics will continue their inexorable progression until the debt trap closes and another empire falls to be replaced by whatever power emerges from the chaos that follows.